Well, wisdom quite often refers either to some kind of ability to make sense of the situation and make a sound decision with the notion of some kind of a good judgment. Other times, wisdom is associated with a sort of like being content and balanced about who one is, how to live one's life, like when you look back at yourself. So in my work, I focus on the former definition, so thinking more about how people make decisions and try to identify the sort of notion of good judgment and sound judgment in everyday life, especially in the context of this kind of ill-defined complex situations where there is no right or wrong solution. So that's maybe what distinguishes wisdom, or how in many societies when people talk about wisdom, they think about this kind of complex issues that don't have a clear-cut solution that can be solved by a simple algorithm.
And amongst that, in terms of wise reasoning in these interpersonal conflicts, what are some of the central aspects of wise reasoning?
So the notion of wise reasoning, so it's necessary for solving this kind of ill-defined complex situations where there is no clear-cut solution, is based on the idea that what can really help you is to think through the complexities and perspectives of different stakeholders, recognize that maybe you don't know everything about the situation at hand. Quite often, especially if it's a complex situation, we don't possess all the information, and our spontaneous tendency very often is to focus on ourselves and like say me, like and you, because you bring in already some certain perspective. But to go beyond that perspective, to recognize your humility, intellectually speaking, just like that, you don't know everything, to consider the perspectives of other people, to consider how the situation may unfold, and that there are multiple ways the situation may unfold, and to try to reconcile these different perspectives, yours, others, to balance it out, realizing that it may not lead to a benefit of a single person, but will be somewhere in the middle. Those are the key features of sort of wise reasoning, have been featured in various philosophical traditions from East Asia, from South Asia, as well as in the Western philosophical canon.
Absolutely. And, your work on intelligence versus wise reasoning, the study that you'd done with Justin Brienza, could you walk through the study setup with folks and some of the key findings that you uncovered?
So the work on wise reasoning and intelligence started actually even before that, Mark. It started when I first started looking at the relationship to well-being and happiness. So like how satisfied are people with their lives? Because the idea there was that, intelligent people are not necessarily happier. In fact, there are at least as many who are miserable. So intelligence does make you happy, but supposedly good judgment and be able to make good decisions is supposed to make you happy. So what's going on there? And so that's why I started looking at the wise reasoning features. So that was the first step, sort of like try to differentiate and contrast wise reasoning and IQ, the way how intelligence normally measured, with respect to this critical feature, subjective well-being, interpersonal relations. So I studied that for quite a while. With Justin Brienza, who's one of the terrific students of mine who recently graduated, we look specifically at the relationship of wise reasoning and intelligence to some extent across a different strata in the population, among people who have high education versus don't have high education, as well as among people from different regions in the United States, more affluent regions and less affluent regions. And essentially, we had a set of studies. In one study, for instance, we asked people to think about the most recent conflict they had with somebody and work through the experience and reconstruct this experience, recall the details of this experience, and afterwards asked people to reflect on it and looked at the qualities of their reflection. So do they recognize that they need more information? Do they consider taking perspectives of other people? Are they willing to compromise? So those features of what I describe as wise reasoning. And it turns out that there were some interesting regional differences and individual differences, and they were going in different direction than you would expect from the classic intelligence research.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that I don't think people intuitively would think, that the higher your social class, the less likely you are to reason wisely.
Right. Yeah, so those were some of the findings, and we find that both, it's not a huge effect, and I want to emphasize that it's also a local effect. What that means is that, and that's, by the way, is revealing to some extent why that may be happening. So we can just speculate, but the reason it may be happening is that if you live in the environment in which a lot of things are uncertain and in which you need to some extent cooperate with others because you will not be able to manage things on your own, then you start developing this reasoning strategies of perspective taking, of recognizing limits of yourself and recognizing the uncertainty there is in the world. More as compared to if you live in an environment in which everything is prepared, you live in your single detached somewhere in the suburbs, you have 1 or 2 cars, the college for kids is paid off, and you can just plan for the future. And there is of course always uncertainty, but it's much less than you. And what you educate your kids to do also is very different. Instead of focusing on maybe other people, you teach them that they are the best, that they will be the next leaders, the next president of the United States if you want. And sort of the mantra that you have for education also in the middle class America and Canada to some extent is very different. What we teach our kids than what maybe blue-collar parents teach their kids, if they have time to teach their kids in the first place. And bottom line is that if you live in this kind of more uncertain, ecologically uncertain environment that is associated with people from less educated, lower income strata, then that by itself forces you to both cooperate with others and to think about different, maybe undesirable alternatives about the future. And those processes force you to develop this wise reasoning. Now, the issue here, and that's why it's important, and I would like to emphasize that,
for sure,
is that it's local, it's specific to the interpersonal domain, and you can still have absolutely no difference, so it may go a completely different direction. Let's say if you think about it, the group questions or political decision making or something else. So what I'm emphasizing, it's specific to the reasoning about the interpersonal issues in their own lives.
And from an evolutionary perspective, Igor, I mean, that seems to make sense in terms of this idea of being in an environment where the future is uncertain, where you might be working multiple jobs to pay the bills, you might not be getting as much sleep as you'd like, you're shuffling the kids off to school and to other events through friends or nannies or whomever else. There needs to be some sort of teamwork involved here. And you don't have as you mentioned, you don't have the luxury of really planning for the future. Is this, from an evolutionary standpoint, if environments are more, I don't know what the right term is, threatening, or there's more stress in them, is that a natural or an evolutionary reaction to have that sort of effect, would you say?
It's possible. I mean, as often with evolutionary ideas, we can only speculate about some of them. You need to consider it in a much longer term perspective. But what we know from prior studies of evolution as well as ecology is that human minds are incredibly adaptive. Depending on the situation, we can really develop different strategies from very early on, how to make sense, how to effectively live in that situation. It doesn't take many generations to do that for humans. So from this perspective, this kind of adaptation of what processes to focus on. So for instance, why would it make sense for a person in a low-income environment where there's so much uncertainty to do well on so-called self-regulation tasks? So one common finding is that kids from low-income environments in North America, instead of waiting for 2 cookies, they will want to rather take 1 cookie now. And so it's like, you can either have 1 cookie now, or you can wait a little bit and then you can get 2 cookies later. And they're taking 1 cookie now. And that's a test of self-regulation, or marshmallow, or whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
That marshmallow test. Instead of 1 marshmallow, now you can have 2 marshmallows later. So why is that happening? Well, if you live in the environment in which everything is highly uncertain, then you don't know if you'll get those 2 cookies later. And so you better live it now, live it to the fullest. Planning for the future is futile because realistically, and in fact, to some extent, certainly in the US, that's not as much the case in Canada, and definitely not in Europe, but in the US, that is true, that they are objectively right not to plan for the future because the society doesn't provide them with resources necessary to really grow and maybe get a better job and maybe get higher education. How can they if the tuition fees are so high? So bottom line is, from that perspective, some of those processes that are considered to be maladaptive, so they are not regulating themselves that well, apparently, could be also construed as evolutionary adaptive. They just do what you would do in an uncertain environment, similar to how many other animals would do it. So it's like for other animals, we also know that when the ecology is uncertain and high risk, they choose different strategies than if the ecology is relaxed and you don't have to worry about the predator, or you don't have to worry about the scarcity of resources.